Welcome to the Human Tell podcast, where category leading insights professionals share a little bit about what we're learning here at Human Tell. Hosted by Lolita Morrow, each episode features voices from industry leaders in sports, media, food, and travel, exploring the why that informs how consumers think, feel, and act. Join us as we connect the dots between data and real life. Here's today's episode. Welcome to the Human Tell podcast. I'm your host, Lolita Morrow. So, food and sustainability, such a dynamic space right now, right? I mean, it involves producing and consuming food in ways that are environmentally sound, socially equitable, economically viable for present and even future generations. Our discussion today is centered around the August 2025 exploration conducted by Our Food Group among over 4,000 Americans. This looked into the issue around food and sustainability, including where food and climate concerns rank among all the things we have been concerned about today, what specific concerns people have about our food system, what individuals are willing to do about these concerns, and who they should feel bears the responsibility for change. Our guests today have a wealth of experience to add context to the data. I'm joined today by Ananta Engineer, a member of our food leadership group who helped develop this study. Ananta is a CPG insights leader who has spent time at Kellogg's, Post, and is currently at McCain Foods. I do love their French fries. Welcome, Ananta. How are you?
Thank you for having me. Wonderful.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. Now, Ananta and I are joined by Arwen Kimmell, a doctor of cultural anthropology, who consults with a range of CPG companies from biggest to the smallest on issues of people, sustainability, and how to navigate towards the future of food. Arwen, welcome to the Human Tell podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. Now, before we begin, I do have a question for both of you. Now, you both have spent years thinking about food systems from many different angles. What drew you personally into this work? And more importantly, what keeps you motivated to study food and sustainability when sometimes these challenges can feel so big? I'll start with you, Ananta.
So, for me, it's a lifelong passion to be in the food industry. Have always enjoyed observing what people eat, why they eat, seeing the trends that are happening, and understanding the changes that happen culturally, environmentally over time when it comes to food. So, for me, it's just been a place that has always kept me interested, excited. There's so much to learn. There's always so much to learn, and to know that we have a part in understanding and maybe helping people eat great food and food that's good for them is something that keeps me going. But the sustainability piece of it, like, it's very important for us to think about where our food comes from and how it impacts everybody, both emotionally and functionally.
Fantastic. What about you, Arwen?
My grandparents started a natural food co-op in the 70s in northern Indiana to help bring clean, healthy, sustainable food to a market that didn't really have any. And they built this legacy of helping people eat better and helping farmers grow better and find markets for their products. And I feel like the work that I do is just the next chapter of that, taking that legacy of hyper local, helping the immediate community to eat better food and to grow better food. And I'm taking that forward and helping brands all over the country to be able to do that. So it's a personal passion as well.
That's amazing. I was just going to say it's so great when passion and purpose can intersect and then do something for the greater good. That's amazing. Well, with that, I think we should just dig into sort of the current state of sustainability. Arwen, I'll keep this with you. The world is such a complicated place, especially now in 2025, right? Things are moving fast. Information is abundant, and we have lots and lots of things that we could be concerned with. In fact, this study actually started by exploring nearly 100 things that people could be anxious about today. Now, we will do a deep dive into that in another episode. But for today, please share with us what you've learned about the overall concerns and where issues of food and sustainability really rank among them.
Yeah, it's a great question. This is a fantastic study because it does go really broad. And we are in a time when consumers and humans have a lot of competing concerns and things that they could spend their time and energy and anxiety thinking about. And food is important, but I think it's interesting and not surprising that the number one concern that rose to the top in relation to food was actually grocery prices. And that's not surprising because people are trying to navigate sort of an ever-changing world of prices and their home economics. And being able to feed your family is sort of not surprising that that's the number one concern. I think from a sustainability standpoint, if you talk to sustainability experts, they'll tell you that all of these things are interrelated and will eventually impact something like grocery prices. But today, other concerns around food fall a little bit lower. And those things that rise to the top among food are those things that are closest to home, closest to your body, your family, your health, your own personal community. So things like chemicals and food products rise to the top. And then things like food waste, which are not just sort of a problem for sustainability, but a problem for your home economics. You don't want to be throwing away food that you spent good, hard earned money on. So those things that are closest to home, so chemicals in our food products, food waste, food safety, food shortages, those are the concerns that rose to the top. Things that are more far-reaching and a little distant from our homes fall a little lower. There, people are still concerned. We still see, more than half of people being concerned about things like environmental damage from factory farming or dependence on other countries for the foods that we eat. Those things that are a little further from your kitchen are lower in the list, but still important to people.
Were you surprised at all about where some of those things ranked? And then thinking about where they ranked, what does that really say about the collective mindset in 2025?
Yeah, I was not surprised. I've been studying sustainability for a long time,
Okay.
and those we're always most concerned with things that hit closest to home, right? It's easier and more tangible to but be concerned about those things that impact your health and your budget and your own kitchen. I think what I'm seeing change over time that is reflected in this data is that the quantity of things that feel close to home are rising. So something like food shortages probably feels closer to home today than it did 10 years ago or sort of before COVID. And so once you've experienced not being able to get the things that you love, that concern gets closer to your own kitchen and your own home. And so more and more people are concerned about that. So it's the level of concern, I think, is rising, but the order didn't really surprise me.
Anana, what were your initial thoughts about the study?
Yeah, very similar to Arwen. With all of the work that we've been doing lately, there's so much weighing on the hearts and minds of consumers. And so they are very concerned with grocery bills right now. They're worried about the economy, their personal finances, the rising cost of everything. They're so aware that this study, shows us that time and time again, it's the same thing. Like they're worried about what's close to home. They are worried about sustainability. I think we saw some of those poppings in the data of like what is important, what they should be concerned about. There's just the thing that surprises me the most is that there is that level of empowerment. Like, how can I do more? Like, I want others to do for me. So that was one of the things that I think was we looked at it more and more. I was not surprised, but I was very intrigued by kind of continuing to hear people understand that they can only do so much. They might want to do more, but they can only do so much
Right.
across the board.
From a CPG perspective, Anata, does this level of consumer concern sort of match what you've seen in boardrooms or some, long range planning? Or is there still a disconnect between the two?
No, I think it's still showing that. We're seeing that in a lot of the broad-based research about, majority of people are concerned about the environment. They're concerned about sustainability. It ebbs and flows in terms of how interested and how concerned they are and how much they feel empowered to do anything. But the concern among the American population has been there, and I think it's been pretty steady for a while.
And even knowing all of those things, what I've seen is there's a pretty big gap between the information and then the impact. And that's one of the things that struck me is how much people are concerned about the issues, but then how little they think these issues can have an impact on them. Anata, what did you see here and in your work generally about how people are sort of connecting the dots? Because I myself have all of this information, but how am I actually turning that into something actionable and being impactful?
I think this goes back to there is this uncertainty about what can I do. You know, it's just me. What can I do? And so that's where there is this call for governments to do more, for corporations to do more, to like you do it for me. Like I want to believe, I want to buy what you're doing, but I think you need to do it for me because there's still this notion of how can one person make an impact? And the thing that we were talking about a lot with this study is that there is that motivated minority. There are the change agents, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but there are people that feel more empowered and able than I think the general population.
One thing that I think it's similar to being concerned about things that you can experience in your kitchen. Over the years, I've seen things like recyclable packaging rise to the top and being able to recycle rise to the top, and the sustainable actions that people are willing to take and want to take and see the impact of. And I think that's because they see the physical, they have the experience of taking that physical package and throwing it in the trash or throwing it in the recycling, and so it feels real. This is something that I know has an impact. I'm putting it in the trash and it's going to the landfill, and so you know there's a perception that has maybe a bigger impact than it really does, but it's something that I can see. It's hard for me to see factory farming. It's hard for me to see pesticides, although I live in Michigan, and you can drive through and you can see the fields, the little pesticide signs. Um, but things that you have your physical hands on, I think, are easier to understand. So things that rise to the top are food waste and recycled packaging, because those are the things that I am going to have the interaction with in my home. I think people do have a desire for bigger action to come from institutions, and that kind of makes sense too. How much can one household impact? When we have these large companies and governments and organizations that could and should have a bigger impact than little old me in my house with my recycle bin.
I think that's
Yeah.
something.
And it's interesting, Arwen, because I was just looking at the newest eating patterns in America, right? And this is like from CPG World. Everyone loves this report. We wait for it every year. And it is that notion about like they're concerned. Are they taking action? About half are saying they're taking action. The number one thing that they say that in terms of taking action is recycling. And it's exactly that. Like I can see an impact. I can feel an impact. I feel connected to the action that I'm taking. And that's a big improvement over time. You think about it's not been that many years since we started talking about recycling and people were really actively doing it and wanting to do it and feeling like it's making an impact. So I think it's very encouraging for other things that people can make an impact on, but it is that little old me, like how much can I do?
Yeah. Especially when you think about this being a category where I guess choice is everywhere, but then I feel like trust sometimes can be fragile. Like, do you think the abundance of data and news about climate change actually overwhelms the consumer rather than sort of empowering them? And I'm thinking of, is there a way that we can sort of simplify storytelling to turn that concern into action instead of just scaring?
Yeah, our data here show that only 40% of people feel like they have, well, sort of the right good enough information about food, their food choices and climate change. I think but people do have both a lack of information and conflicting information. You know, we talk about recycling and recycling your food packaging, and that's something that's tangible. I feel like you can do it. But you don't have to travel very far on the internet or Netflix to find somebody telling you that the recycling system is broken. And when the things you recycle don't actually make it through to be recycled. And so that diversity of information and the breadth of information, I do think it paralyzes people a little bit. They're not sure who to believe. They're not sure if their action really makes a difference. And so that limits their willingness to go out of their way, to pay more, to be inconvenienced, to change the way that they eat and their family eats in order to make these changes when they're not sure that they're really going to make a difference. So quantity of information, conflicting information, and I think it really does get in the way of people feeling like they can and should take action.
It leads me to thinking almost like, well, what do we do about this? Do we need a leader? Who's responsible for sort of leading that change? I think clearly feeding a growing population on an ever-changing planet, that's a huge challenge, and that's not going to go away. But how can like food producers, individuals, or governments really act again to help ensure the future? So while we're making these small changes, um, do you think it's very important for us to have someone sort of lead that charge for us?
I think for a long time, the storyline and sustainability with consumers was sort of do your part, be empowered to make change. And like we were struck in the data with how I think this narrative of empowerment, it's important. I think people do want to be empowered, but I think they also want big institutions, the government, food companies, retailers to stand up and do their bigger part. And the data really do say, you know, institutions carry a large part of the responsibility, and consumers want them to do the right thing. I think that the balance of that goes back to that very top concern around food prices. What people don't want is for a food manufacturer to do the right thing and then force the consumer to carry the full burden of the cost of doing that. I think the sort of shared responsibility between consumers and institutions and the government is sort of the future. It's how we're all going to make a real difference in this space. But it is a lot of pressure being put from in the data on institutions, on governments, on food manufacturers, on retailers to do the right thing.
You know, what does that shared responsibility sort of look like for you? And is there a place where we need to draw the line between corporate action and personal accountability?
Yeah, there's this data point that I think is interesting that so 69% of folks in our data said individuals shouldn't be expected to solve climate by themselves. And then even more than that, 79% said businesses should keep sustainable foods affordable, even if it means making less profit. And I can't tell you how many times in my career I've tested a concept with innovative, unique, sustainability-oriented benefit like packaging or regeneratively grown or some sort of unique benefit, and consumers just aren't willing to shoulder the full burden of the cost of those things. And so I think there's this balance between sort of maximizing profit and maximizing sustainability and keeping prices manageable for the consumer. I think eventually we're going to need to get to some sort of balance where these kinds of offerings with great, unique, sustainable packaging and food are not as expensive as they could be. And that might mean that food manufacturers still need to make a profit, but maybe a little less profit on those things.
Yes. Anada, I'd love to hear your perspective, especially having such a breadth of knowledge in that CPG space and being in those rooms. What can you share with us about the behaviors and sort of should we draw a line between personal accountability and really a lot of the producers sort of stepping in, leading the charge?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because same with Arwen, like I've been seeing this for so many years where consumers do feel very burdened and a little apathetic about paying for things that they feel like companies should do. And what's interesting is that so many companies that I work at, you look at all of their share reports as well from across other big CPG, and they are committed to environmental impact. I don't think they talk about it or tell the story as well to consumers. So consumers aren't so clear as to the fact that they are already doing these things, or sometimes the promises are very far out. We're going to do X, Y, and Z by 2035. Well, it's hard for consumers who are dealing with the here and now and the prices and the struggles that they're going through to think about that 10, 20-year promise that a company is making. So I think there's an opportunity for companies to be a little bit more upfront about how they care, what they're doing, how they are helping consumers care and be active. And so consumers don't have to feel like it's all on them, and they can feel more connected and comfortable with the companies that they're buying from. But I think there is a bit of a gap of telling the story in a way that is meaningful, that is authentic, and that is truly reflecting work that is making a change.
That's even a great sort of segue into sort of the agents of change. You know, as you both are speaking, the questions are sort of flooding in my mind, like, well, how can some of the food manufacturers work with consumers to affect the change? And then what group of people are probably most likely to make changes that help affect the climate? You know, is there a certain uniqueness about a particular group? And if we do identify this group, sort of how should marketers work to connect with them? Either of you have thoughts
Arwen,
on
do you
that?
want to go?
That that was deep. That was just in my head. It was floating up totally, but
I think
Yeah.
Arwen and I were super excited by this whole notion of change agents, right? Like
yeah,
there is, I think we've always understood that they're there, but to be able to understand them deeper within the study was really fascinating for me because we know that there are some people that just have a bigger voice. They have a stronger passion. And we know that they're going to do a nice job of helping others see their way. But they're connected to maybe a small group here and a small group there. And so how do we get more of their voices and understand? But I think it's some CPG and some sub brands out of CPG do a better job of connecting with those agents of change than others.
Yeah, it's a fascinating group of people. There are always I've worked with a lot of consumer segmentations, and there are often a group of people who are sort of the most passionate, the most dedicated, the most knowledgeable on on any topic, and we definitely see this here in the sort of realm of sustainability. And I love the name change agents because these people feel they're more knowledgeable, they feel more empowered to make change, they're more willing to make changes in what they eat and how they buy and how they behave. And when we build a profile of them, there's some really cool psychographic things that sort of rise to the top when we think about these change agents. So they tend to be younger. They're more likely to be under 50 than other consumers. There are a lot of parents in this group, which I think is not surprising. You know, moments in in the life cycle where you sort of start to think about the world outside of yourself. Becoming a parent is definitely one of those where you start to think about the future and about the planet and about the lives that your children and grandchildren are going to have. So younger, more likely to have kids in the household. They're more likely to be of faith and care about faith and think about faith as being an important part of their life. They lean a little bit liberal, and I know getting into politics is not sort of our goal here, but I think it's very interesting that they are pretty evenly divided between conservative and liberal. So this is not a political stance, this is more of a personal stance. They think about food, they're mindful eaters. And so, one of the things that it's important to think about is that connection between sustainability and health, and that the things that you eat are going to have an impact on your own body as well as the environment. They're social eaters. They think about things like eating from other cultures and respecting other cultures. And all of this sort of get together creates this group of humans that are willing and able and interested in making change in this space of the climate. And so we could think about what kinds of stories could connect with those people to help push them even further. And then how do we harness this group of people to help influence out and create more agents of change, more people that are willing to take action.
You actually mentioned something that was going to lead into my next question, which was about the change agents and their motivation.
Yeah.
So I love that most of them are motivated by values, because I was wondering, maybe was it about status or just something else entirely differently? But knowing that most of these are motivated by their values, that could help guide companies how to talk to them. And is there a way that companies should talk to these change agents about sustainability without, you know, without it feeling like elitist, I guess, in a way, if that makes sense?
Question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ananta.
No, I was just thinking, and it's funny because when I think of change agents, like I've known Arwen a long time, and I think when we heard her intro, like she's definitely someone who is so passionate and understands this so well.
Yeah.
But I think that the thing about change agents is that they're educated and they understand. So when companies talk to them, there's more information. You have to give more information and talk to them in a way that's different than you might talk to the general public, because you have to be ready for them to challenge. So not only will they be able to champion, but they're going to challenge you. And I think that's really a good thing, but it's a different type of conversation that gives opportunity as well.
And I think because of these change agents, they're able to sort of pull the topic and the noise of sustainability into the mainstream more, and then more people will start to have more trust and believe in that. Um, but when I think about maybe what could get in the way, what barriers, um, are there any barriers to change? I think that governments or maybe food manufacturers can help consumers make more easy choices, to make more sustainable choices easier. I know we said we didn't want to get into politics too much, but we'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that first, Arwen.
Yeah, I think there's, when we think about the change agent, Ananta is exactly right. This is a consumer who's more knowledgeable, more educated. They're going to want more information. They're going to want sort of a little proof that you're doing the things that you're doing. And I think speaking to those folks, the barrier is more around trust and are you following through with what you're doing? I think when you think about a more mainstream average consumer, more information might not be right for them because they're already overwhelmed. They already feel like they are not sure who to believe and what the right thing is to do and buy. And so for that consumer, coming up with very clear, simple, actionable information and choices, I think is really important. When we look at the barriers, not knowing enough, not being able to understand enough, and things costing too much, we go all the way back to grocery prices. I think those things get in the way. And so making it easy and clear and not too much of a burden, not too much of a change. We see that people are less willing to make change when it disrupts the flow of their lives. So, we look at things like willingness to eat plant-based meat it's a hard challenge for people to really change the way they behave. And there is about half, little less than half of people say, it's hard to change long-standing habits. That's why I'm not behaving in a different way. So I'm not acting more in this space. I think, information and easy are the sort of the magic combination so that people can know they're making a good choice and not have to disrupt their lives too much to be able to do it.
Do you think one is easier than the other? So if we talk about barriers and think about the 3 C's, so there's cost, I guess convenience, and then like confusion, which would be the easiest for an industry to address, let's say in the next 5 years? And then is there a certain barrier that will take generational work or more systemic work? Either of you can jump on that one.
I think all three are important.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's hard to pick one over the other. We are just seeing, I saw the term environmental apathy because prices are so high, right? So cost is always going to be the one thing. But it's funny, like working in food for so long, really the most important thing is taste. And you kind of you can't forget that, because and it's eating with your eyes and your mouth, right? Because you still have to have the functional and the emotional eating experience. But like everything that we do when we make a change for the better has to be compared to the previous version. You cannot make it taste worse to be better for the environment. And so like food, always the number one driver, the table stakes is taste. And so that's a hard one to always be able to reconcile, because it is the most important thing, and they don't want to believe if they can't taste it to believe it.
True. Can either of you speak to, was there any part of the research that sort of revealed any surprising, like psychological barriers where, we were talking already about the most well-intentioned consumer still just won't act? Was there anything that was sort of surprising from a psychological perspective that you found?
Yeah, it goes back to what Ananta was just saying. I think, between us, we've probably run, hundreds of attribute sorts about what's important to people in different categories and different consumer groups. And taste and price are almost always the top of those lists. And so it's, people won't buy what they can't afford, and they won't eat what they don't like. So I think that sort of taste price combination is really interesting when we look at something like switching out the foods. So I think, a lot of people will say that the, one big thing, if not the biggest thing that an average little old me could do to impact positively the environment and the climate would be to eat less meat. Eat less meat, eat more vegetables. There are lots of experts who would say that's a good thing to do. And when we look at the willingness to do that, it gets a little light for the average consumer when you get down to doing something like eating a plant-based meat alternative or eating lab-grown meat, some of these options that are out there. There's an interesting difference. They're more willing to do plant-based dairy than plant-based meat. And I think that's an interesting shift in culture over time. And I credit the to-go coffee industry with the oat milk latte, making plant-based dairy product very, very accessible and taste really good. And a lot of them are not charging a lot more for an oat milk latte. And so it's winning on all of those, right? It tastes great. It's healthy. It's not a whole lot more expensive. And so I'm able to make that change. There's this very closely held relationship with meat, with beef in the United States. And it's harder for people to imagine making that change and shifting into a plant-based or lab-grown alternative to something that feels so culturally important. A hamburger on the 4th of July or a steak for a celebration are they're cultural, right? It's very important to a lot of people in this country. And so asking them to make a departure like that feels a lot harder. And so it's interesting to see how that culture could change over time. Is there an oat milk latte experience that could help make eating plant-based meat a little less scary, a little cooler?
I was looking for my hand clap emoji for that oat-based latte. I do love that. So if we were back here in 5 years, if we came back to this podcast 5 years from now, what would success look like for both of you? What would make you both say, we really moved the needle on food sustainability?
I think it's a bit of a change in the common, like general pop understanding of how the choices that we make and how we buy and what we do and the companies that we buy from can impact sustainability overall. So, we want people to be thinking like about farming practices. We want them to think about where their food comes. We want people to understand the work that's being done. I know the company I work for right now, we do a lot of work with regenerative agriculture, and consumers aren't so sure what that means. So I think success will be helping people understand efforts that are being made, why it's important, why we should care, And I think that's kind of growing right now. It's hard on the back of a package to tell people everything that's happening based on the food that they're buying. So we need people to understand a little bit more. And I think we're just starting on some of those impacts and general understanding, because it's the change agents know a lot. We're hoping that more people understand um, just the impact that can be made or is being made or is in progress right now.
I'm going to answer it two ways. One, in line sort of with where Ananta was, I think that I think if in 5 years we looked at the marketplace to measure success, I would hope that there are far more healthy, delicious, tasty, affordable, sustainable options in the marketplace. And that action would come from sort of all of us. It would be consumers demanding more. It would be manufacturers working harder and making more. And we would see that out in the marketplace. We'd see it in the grocery store. I think the other way that I would evaluate success is in the data. And there's this interesting disconnect between the different elements of sustainability. And if you talk to, sustainability, climate, environmental experts, they'll tell you that all of these things are interconnected. The soil quality and the chemicals and the pesticides in the soil, and the antibiotics that are used in meat, and the environmental damage that we're seeing from these things, and all of those things are going to impact the quality of the food, the healthfulness of the food, the availability of the food, and eventually that top concern around grocery prices. And so I would love for those concern numbers to be a little tighter if we did this study in 5 years, that more people are connecting the dots between the quality of the soil and the quality of the food, the availability of the food, and the prices they're paying at the grocery store. And I think the more people are pulling those threads and pulling everything together, the more action they're going to be willing to take, because they can see the impact across in sort of a big picture and not just in their own personal home.
That's great. I think you both should be on the lookout for a calendar invite from me 5 years from now, because I want us to definitely see what has happened. So a final wrap-up question, and I'll start with you, Ananta. What's one thing you challenge listeners to do differently this week, just to be a part of the solution? Something that doesn't feel impossible or overwhelming. We talked about we have so many things and so many concerns, but is there something we can do even in this week to just be a part of that change?
Such a good question. Like some of it's just, I feel like it's taking the time to gather information. Like we all have our own media sources. We all have curated content. But if we really want to understand what's happening, we might need to do a couple of double clicks and take a look at the companies that we care about or that we work for and see what their sustainability practices are. What are their promises? What are they committed to? How are they thinking about you as a consumer and their impact on the environment? Because I think, everything that we can do to keep educating ourselves will help us be change agents, or at least know what to be looking out for when we're at the grocery store.
What about you, Arwen?
One thing.
One thing that they can do
Arwen's like, I
differently
can't
this
just have
week.
one thing.
One.
One thing. I think one thing would be to at the grocery store, look beyond the things you currently buy and think to yourself, what are these choices giving me? Is there a more sustainable choice? Is there a certification or a ingredient list that would be more sustainable? And incorporate that little question to yourself when you're choosing between options at the grocery store. In addition to, is it tasty, and the price and all, does it feel healthy to me? Is there a cue on this package that tells me if this is a more sustainable choice? Start to get educated about what those cues are at the grocery store.
both of you shared some great advice, and I'm looking at myself, and I want to try to just tighten that gap between the information, all the information that I'm gathering out there about sustainability and my impact. And sometimes it is just that one thing where I can become my own change agent. And if the barrier is cost, if the barrier is confusion or convenience, be able to sort of segment those. Because if we all made one tiny choice within the next week, I think the conversation 5 years from now would be amazing, and we all would be very happy about that. Um, I'm going to put a bow on this and just wrap this up on our conversation about food and sustainability. I want to thank you so much, Ananta and Arwen, for really sharing your perspectives with the audience. The food group of the Human Tell podcast, we are going to continue on with this work, continue exploring issues such as social pressures and other sources of influence around food and sustainability. We'll continue to look at the impact on different product claims. You spoke about that, Arwen, even at point of sale, and really how people are defining and acting around ultra processed foods. And Anata, you spoke about the regenerative agriculture as well. In a future episode, we will also share what we've learned about all the things that people are anxious about today. And there's so much to be anxious about today, from food to the economy, to technology, to the government, to social upheaval. My blood pressure is rising just saying that. But we are going to continue to learn from that so we can get better. For you out there, if you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to keep learning about why people make the choices they make in food, sports, travel, and more. And we'll be back next time to share a little more human intelligence from our community. Arwen, Anata, thank you so much. And everyone else, until then, stay curious. That will do it for today's episode of the Human Tell podcast. Our thanks to all of you who came by to listen. We hope today's conversation gave you something to think about. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to keep learning about why people make the choices they make in food, sports, travel, and more. We'll be back next week to share a little more human intelligence from our community. Until then, stay curious.